Hey everybody, welcome back. We're in Unit 10, Lesson 6, so go ahead, take out your journals, open up to the next available page, and please remember to write down that essential question. How will President Jimmy Carter contribute to the future of America? In this lesson today, we're going to be talking about James Earl Carter, President of the United States from 1977 to 1981. There he is, the Camp David Accords with the Egyptian president and the Israeli prime minister. Make sure to write down this heading, and let's go ahead and begin talking about Jimmy Carter. He's from Georgia, and he is a Southern Democrat, and he had been literally a peanut farmer, and now he's president of the United States. I'm not kidding about the peanut farmer thing, but there's more to this peanut farmer than meets the eye. He'd also actually been a graduate of the very prestigious Naval Academy of Annapolis in Maryland. And he'd been a naval officer on a nuclear submarine in his naval career. And Jimmy Carter was a very earnest, very honest, very devout Christian, good person. And it's important to understand the context of the 1970s that America had been grappling with political leaders that were very, very evil. Political leaders that had lied to us, like Richard Nixon with the Watergate scandal. So after Nixon and the Watergate scandal, after all the lies that we've been told about the Vietnam War, remember that we discovered from like the Pentagon Papers in 1971, America was ready for a president that we could trust. Look at that smile, Jimmy Carter, he's a nice guy. Or, you know, they have this saying that like nice guys finish last. Well, Jimmy Carter is not known for being a very good president. He's dealing with a very unfortunate economic situation. So even though he's this outsider that America feels like we can trust, he's not involved in all that icky, slimy scandals that are happening in DC, he's still not going to be a very successful president. So let's talk about what's happening. In the 1970s, there is this stagflation issue still occurring. Remember, stagflation we talked about with Jerry Ford is where you have really high inflation and really high unemployment. Those are two bad things for an economy, okay? So economic growth basically stagnates or comes to a standstill. If you're not growing economically, that means businesses are not growing. That means people are not making as much money, and we're all kind of suffering, okay? It's called the misery index in the 1970s, and it's gonna basically double. But remember, stagflation was caused by a variety of factors. America, beginning by the 70s, to actually import more than it could export, Nixon taking us off of the gold standard, and then also mainly due to the OPEC oil embargo in 1973. When we weren't getting our oil from the Middle East. And so because of this, you're seeing manufacturing decline. You're seeing large swaths of Americans who had worked in industry, those blue collar jobs, being laid off. And unemployment is growing really, really scary. High inflation, that's inflation when prices rise over time. If prices become too high for all sorts of things we buy and people aren't getting, increase in their wages, then people won't be able to buy anything. And that causes businesses to not be able to sell things. And again, businesses will have to lay off people. And you see the effects like we talked about for the Great Depression, that, this causes this. Eventually we end up with a lot of people that are out of work. And that's the really bad part about all this. That area of the Northwest, well, not the Northwest at this time, but the area of the United States where you have Michigan, Indiana, Ohio, Pennsylvania. Today, that highly old industrialized sector of the United States where we used to have, Carnegie Steel there in Pittsburgh, or like Rockefeller's oil refineries and all these factories, all this manufacturing, like Michigan, that's Car Central from Henry Ford. This manufacturing area begins by the 70s to dry out. Like a lot of those manufacturing jobs are lost, or they move overseas, and a lot of those factory workers get laid off. They lose their jobs, and that's why this area is called the Rust Belt. And so because of the oil embargo, with these OPEC nations, these Middle East oil nations not selling America oil because of our support for Israel and because of America getting off of the gold standard, it really showcased how dependent we were on foreign oil. Remember, gas prices quadrupled. There were people waiting to get gas, wrapped around gas stations, waiting for hours. It was called the energy crisis there in the early 70s because of all this. And so as a result, Jimmy Carter as president is going to kind of focus on the environment in a big way. We'd had Teddy Roosevelt set aside millions of acres to become our national parks. And we'd had under Johnson, as part of the Great Society, the Clean Air and Clean Water Act. And we'd had under Nixon the creation of the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. We'd also had in the 1960s the publication of Rachel Carson's book, The Silent Spring, which talked about the harmful effects of the things we were putting into the ground that were poisoning us, like the pesticides and the herbicides and other things. But here, Jimmy Carter is actually going to put an emphasis on the environment through our energy sector, and he's going to create the Department of Energy, which regulates all the energy sources for the United States. Now, this is a really important topic, especially for us Texans. We are one of the largest energy producers in the United States. And then also this year that I'm filming this in 2021, in February of this year, we had a terrible, terrible ice storm that was totally unprecedented. We've had ice storms before in 2011 and in 1989 and whatever, but this was the first time that our entire energy grid really failed us. And we saw just how important and how delicate the system is, and how the lack of regulations and reform on this can lead to devastating effects when people lose power in the middle of sub-zero, freezing temperatures. And so this Department of Energy, it's to prevent things from happening like that. And it's to try to get America less dependent on foreign fuel. Part of this was Carter creating the Strategic Oil Reserve, which you can see in this map at the bottom right, is where in the Gulf Coast in Louisiana and Texas, we have a stockpile of fuel in case we totally run out of our foreign reserves and elsewhere. We have enough to get us through like a month or 2 month emergency. So that's the Strategic Oil Reserve. Now, in general, what Carter wants to do to reduce America's dependence on like Middle Eastern oil is to have America, provide its own fuel, or to look to alternative fuel sources. And so this is the beginning of green energy. That's using getting energy from sources that are not based on natural gas or oil or coal. So this is like solar power and wind power, and can also deal with nuclear power, which we'll talk about in just a second. So that's some of the stuff that's going to be happening under Carter. He'll even actually put solar panels on the roof of the White House for an effort to promote green energy. Now, the Community Reinvestment Act, that is going to be the CRA, it was called. It was passed in 1977 as a way to reinvigorate low-income neighborhoods, mainly in cities. Remember that urban decay had been a crippling problem since the rise of suburbs in the 1950s and white flight. Remember that Johnson's Great Society and War on Poverty had sought to address some of these issues, but one of the big issues still plaguing many people of color in low-income neighborhoods in American cities was the fact that they weren't able to get loans to purchase houses. They weren't able to attract businesses or able to stimulate the growth of the economy of their neighborhood because it was redlined. It was basically classified as an area that was at risk for businesses going there. That like, hey, don't go to this area; it's a bad part of town, And so that redlining really crippled a lot of these people of color, minority groups, low-income groups in cities. The Community Reinvestment Act sought to assist with this and fix this problem by basically forcing banks and others to invest in these areas and put businesses in these areas. And it's been somewhat successful. It has reinvigorated some areas in cities, but at the same time, another problem that it's led to has been this issue called gentrification, where you have businesses, start up and restaurants and other boutiques and stuff be built and go into these areas that previously had been really like bad parts of town, bad parts of the city that were really like poor. And they get businesses because of this, but they kick out a lot of the people that had been living in that area. They get kind of taken over. And so that has been an ongoing issue with this. And then the other issue is just, forcing banks and others to provide loans for low-income families or businesses from people of color or other things. They haven't always had the best enforcement on this. So that's been the Community Reinvestment Act of 1977. It's been updated many times since it was originally passed. Okay. Now, so Carter creates this Department of Energy to try to get America less dependent on foreign oil. We are investing in green energy, like solar panels he puts on the White House, wind energy, like, I like to cycle. I do a lot of bicycling for exercise. And so I go and bike out to Mart, as I live in East Waco. That's like 20 miles and something. And every time I do that bike ride, I go right by all of these windmills that they just put up in like the Riesel and Mart area. It's really cool. They're huge windmills. You can see on Loop 340 all the time. They're building more and more of these windmills. You could see the big, turbines for it, on those trucks going down Loop 340. So wind energy is a big growing industry in America today. It began in the 1970s. Solar energy, the solar panels, since our Snowmageddon that we've had in February, there's lots of talk and lots of more interest in many private homeowners putting solar panels on their rooftops to subsidize their energy bill every month. And so those are good things, but they're not going to be enough to replace our dependence on fossil fuels. Okay. The only thing that is really powerful, the only other energy source that is really powerful enough to generate enough electricity to absolutely replace fossil fuels like coal and natural gas and oil is nuclear energy. And nuclear energy is the main source of energy for most of the other developed nations of the world today. For instance, I believe the majority of the energy on the continents of Europe, I know specifically like in France and in Germany, comes from nuclear energy. In China, it's the biggest growing energy sector. In Japan, they famously had the Fukushima energy meltdown after their big tsunamis there in 2010. But Japan relies on nuclear energy, Australia, South Asia. So most of us, the world uses nuclear energy. And although it does have waste, which is highly radioactive, it burns a lot cleaner than fossil fuels. It doesn't have those carbon emissions that it puts out in the atmosphere. Now, so proponents, those who were for nuclear energy, were saying all these things and like, this is the way to get us off fossil fuels. This is the way to get us off of our dependence on, Middle Eastern oil and OPEC. If we could just start switching our energy grid over to nuclear energy, this is the way we can do it. But there was a terrible accident that occurred in 1979 at 3 Mile Island, kind of in Pennsylvania near New York. And at this nuclear reactor at 3 Mile Island, they'd had a partial meltdown of one of the reactors, and they'd had to vent off some of the nuclear radiation into the atmosphere, and it got into the groundwater and other things. There was a higher level of incidence of cancer after this that was attributed to the release of the radioactivity. It wasn't a complete meltdown. In 1986, in Chernobyl, in the country of Ukraine, next to Russia, there will be a almost complete meltdown of a nuclear reactor that will decimate the city of Chernobyl. Decimated, 10% is destroyed. So that was very famous. So this wasn't that bad, but it was enough to freak America out. We get really scared. All these people who were saying nuclear energy is great, it's totally safe. All these people who watched on television as the radiation was being, released at 3 Mile Island, they were like, no, it's not. It'll cause your babies to be grown with 20 fingers. Yeah, that's more than you normally have. It'll cause, all kinds of mutations and stuff from cancer and from tumors and all sorts of issues from the radioactivity. And so it really scares America. And I think this is one of the great tragedies of American history, because the green movement today is really important. It's really powerful. And talking about like where America is going to be going, you know, we are one of the largest polluters in the world today, and that's because we don't rely on nuclear power like a lot of the rest of the world. The nuclear power plants that we have, you know, they still produce like a whole fifth of the entire energy grid, entire energy output of the United States, but there's still like, you know, 4/5 of our energy output that mostly comes from fossil fuels. You know, and we have the growing solar and wind, but still we rely mostly on fossil fuels. And so we generate all of this pollution. And that's because we were so scared to use nuclear power. There are only about 2 nuclear power plants in like the state of Texas. If we'd had more, we probably wouldn't have been freezing our butts off back in February. So this was a great tragedy. Carter tried to bring more nuclear power, nuclear energy to the United States, but because of this incident, it just doesn't happen. And today, the nuclear power plants that we do have that produce, you know, 1/5 of America's energy, they are largely very old, getting older, very outdated. And that makes them dangerous. We need to modernize our system. We need to build newer reactors. We need to have the kind of you know, efficient reactors that they're building over in Europe that can even use their waste and reuse it and recycle it. We don't have any of that capability here. We're just way too far behind. So that is the 3 Mile Island disaster, and that was in 1979. So America kind of puts the brakes on nuclear energy. And again, question mark, was that a mistake? Do some research. All right. Now, talking about Jimmy Carter's foreign policy, he is going to be dealing with a lot of stuff already on the domestic side. He's got all this stuff going on now. In foreign policy, Jimmy Carter will agree to the Panama Canal Treaty with the Panamanian government, which will agree to give back the Panama Canal to Panama by the end of the century. So in the year 2000, Carter agreed to hand it over. Remember, Teddy Roosevelt had originally made a deal with the Panamanians in exchange for our helping them break away from Colombia. They would give us the zone, the little strip of land where we built the canal. We built it from 1904 to 1914. It cost thousands of laborers their lives. It cost millions of dollars. And it's one of the world wonders, the great shortcut between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, reducing travel time by thousands of miles and weeks and weeks. And so we agreed to hand this over. It's going to cost us economically, but I think, you know, it was probably the right thing to do to give the Panama Canal Zone back to the Panamanian government and to the Panamanian people. And so that's why Carter did it. Carter is a big believer in human rights. I'm going to say humanitarianism. He is. He's known as one of the greatest ex-presidents we've ever had because of his belief in helping people and building schools and libraries and getting his hands dirty and being willing to, you know, do things to help people all around the world. And so he brings this to the presidency as much as he was able to. And probably the most successful thing that Carter was able to do was the Camp David Accords. So Camp David is the big presidential retreat in the woods. It's very beautiful there. And that's where presidents invite foreign leaders to discuss important issues, you know, kind of on retreat. And so in 1977, to put a stop to the ongoing Israeli-Egyptian wars that had been happening since the 1960s, Carter will invite the Egyptian president, Anwar Sadat, and the Israeli Prime Minister, Begin. He will invite them to this presidential retreat to basically, you know, just the 3 of them talk things out and see if a peace agreement could finally be worked out in the Middle East. Remember that Israel was a country that was formed after World War II as a homeland for Holocaust survivors, for the Jewish people. And it is to this day the only Jewish-led country in the world, and it was carved out of a section of the Middle East that was dominated by Arab Muslim peoples who were essentially kicked out of their land by the British and American government to make room for these Jewish survivors and they did not appreciate this fact. And that's why the Palestinians, those Arabs who were kicked out of their homeland, they have been, and their neighbors, their Arab brothers, have been in constant warfare with Israel since its creation, which hopefully helps to explain to you guys why there's been so much conflict in the Middle East since World War II, since Israel was first formed. Hopefully that helps to get some background to that. Now, with the Yom Kippur War, the ongoing Egyptian Israeli conflict, eventually Carter at Camp David was able to get the two leaders to agree to peace, to stop Egypt and Israel from fighting one another. It was a great accomplishment, peace in the Middle East. It doesn't mean that all of Israel's neighbors, all of the other Arab nations are going to stop fighting Israel, because they certainly have not. But there has been peace between Egypt and Israel since the Camp David Accords in 1977. That's a major accomplishment, and that was entirely thanks to the efforts of President Carter there. You could see him with the Egyptian president and the Israeli prime minister. One other side note, kind of a little bit sad though, is that not everybody in Egypt or Israel was happy with their leaders agreeing to this peace. And so the Egyptian president, Sadat, who agreed to this, he eventually does get assassinated because of these peace talks that he'd agreed to. Carter is continuing détente, which remember began under Nixon, this policy of calming things down in the Cold War. Let's slow things down. Let's cool the Cold War, okay? But he's also dealing with a Soviet Union that is increasingly getting into foreign entanglements. The Soviet Union in 1980 is going to begin to wage war in a country called Afghanistan against the Taliban and other groups, because the Soviet Union was looking to expand their communism there. And it's basically like the Soviet Union's version of the Vietnam War that we had, where they got involved into a situation that was really messy, and they create a kind of civil war that they will not be able to get out of without making a bigger mess. So it's the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan has kind of been compared to like the American Vietnam War. And interestingly, during this in the 1980s, we'll talk about this later, the American government in the 1980s under President Ronald Reagan will actually fund the anti-communist fighters, the Taliban, led by a man named Osama bin Laden. We will be funding him and giving him American weapons and funding so that he can fight the Soviet Union there in his country, in Afghanistan. But anyway, in response to what the Soviet Union was doing, Jimmy Carter will actually boycott the 1980 Olympic Games in protest, saying, hey, we don't agree with the Soviet Union having this war. We're not going to participate in y'all's Olympics. And in general, Carter does make a big departure from previous American presidents in saying that he's going to put humanitarian rights over the interest of Cold War rhetoric. And what I mean by this is that if there's a leader that is anti-communist but still a dictator, Diem, no Dinh Diem of South Vietnam, anyone? If there's a leader like that, that's a dictator, America under Jimmy Carter will not support them. He doesn't care if they're anti-communist. What matters first and foremost to Jimmy Carter is, are they a good person, okay? If they're a dictator that's killing their people, he doesn't care if they're anti-communist or not. He's not going to support them. All right, and then the last topic I want to discuss with President Carter, the ending of his presidency, is the famous Iran hostage crisis. So to give you guys a little background, Iran is this country in the Middle East right next to Iraq. It has an ancient history. It used to be called Persia, the Persian Empire. Most of the Iranian people are very proud of their history. It goes back thousands of years. They speak not just Arabic, but also Persian is a language there. And they are going to actually elect their own leader in the early 1950s. But the problem was that this leader, Mohammad Mossadegh, he was a nationalist who refused to agree to give foreigners Iran's oil. And we did not like this. We wanted Iran's oil. So our CIA and the British MI6, they are going to help stage a coup to depose Mohammad Mossadegh, the democratically elected leader of Iran, and instead place in charge a person who would be more likely to follow our lead and give us their oil. And that was the young Shah of Iran. The Shah is like a title for king, and his name was Reza Pavlini. And so the young Shah is basically like our puppet leader. Like, we put him there, we're pulling the strings, we're saying, hey, we want your oil. You gotta do what we say. And he was very excessive. You know, he had dinners flown in on Concorde jet planes from Paris. He had all sorts of sports cars. It was rumored that his wife had baths with milk instead of water for her skin, and just all these kinds of excesses. And meanwhile, the Iranian people were starving. They weren't even getting the profits of their own oil, which he was selling at cheaper prices to America and to Europe. And so many conservative Muslims in Iran, they were calling for new leadership. They said, this Shah is not the leader we chose. We want somebody else. And in 1979, to protest the Shah's rule, because the Shah got sick, he had cancer, and he's actually going to flee Iran and seek asylum, safety, and medical treatments in the United States. Jimmy Carter will actually allow the Shah into the United States for treatment and to hide out. And this is the Iranian Revolution. So the Shah basically, he escapes, we allow him in. That's going to anger the Iranians, and they are going to place in charge a new leader, the Ayatollah Khomeini, who is a religious figurehead. So Iran will become a theocracy, a government ruled by religion, and this is the religion called Islam, and they are ruled by Islamic law to this day. So they become a theocracy. So this is the Iranian Revolution of 1979. And in response to America, allowing the Shah in, and because of our involvement earlier in deposing their leader to begin with back under Eisenhower with our CIA in the 1950s, a group of Iranian students in Tehran, the capital of Iran, will actually take hostage Americans that were at the American embassy in Tehran. Now, an embassy is a place in the capital of a foreign country that is the sovereign soil of your country, where your people in that country can get help and passports and all kinds of stuff. So there is an American embassy in the capital of basically every other country of the world, just like they have their embassies for their countries in Washington, D.C. So it's a place, you can go to work out passports and talk to representatives of your country while you're living in a different place. So in 1980, you're gonna have these 50 or so American hostages taken, and they will be held for about 444 days. I think that was 1979. They were actually taken hostage. And every day on the news, Walter Cronkite and the news anchors, they would come on and they would say, day 33 of the hostage crisis, day 52 of the hostage crisis, day 400 of the hostage crisis. Like, it continued on and on and on. So every day Americans are being reminded that these American workers at our embassy were taken hostage by these Iranian students, and that Jimmy Carter is going to be unable to rescue them. Now, for his part, President Carter, he tried many different things. He tried to negotiate with the new Iranian government. He tried to send a military Operation Eagle Claw, to rescue them with our helicopters, but they ended up crashing in the high winds of the desert as they were en route, which was very embarrassing. And he tries to do all these things, and it's just not working. And then finally, in the election, Jimmy Carter loses big time in 1980 to his Republican challenger, Ronald Reagan. And on the very day that Reagan was being sworn into office in January of 1981, the hostages are released. Now, if you find that timing suspicious, that's for good reason. Why would they why would the Iranian government, the Iranian, college students that did this, why would they only release the American hostages after Reagan was sworn in? Maybe Reagan and his peeps, like his vice president, who had been former director of the CIA, a man named George H.W. Bush, maybe they had a little something to deal with the Iranian governments and about the hostage crisis before he was elected. Maybe it had something to do with the election itself. But anyway, that is all ongoing, and that is the Iran hostage crisis. It will lead to Carter losing big time, being an embarrassment and a failure in the 1980 presidential election, and then we will get new president named Ronald Reagan. All right, thank you guys so much. Don't forget to do a summary, and I will talk to you guys later. Bye-bye.